The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the pinnacle of bomber development in World War II. Forever remembered as the aircraft that delivered the first atomic weapons, the B-29 was a vision of the future, pressurized, high altitude and with devastating destructive power. It was the piston-engine future. As always, war was the catalyst for rapid advances in mechanization and aviation technology. The Americans realised very quickly that the aircraft available to them, the B-24 and the B-17, were effective in Europe over relatively short distances, but would be a different type of war in Japan and the Pacific. They needed a super bomber, an aircraft capable of carrying more bombs over a greater distance. Before the days of aerial refuelling and with massive gas-guzzling piston engines, this required thinking on a whole new level. Many companies threw their hats into the design ring, but it was Boeing who had the most daring vision of a long-range bomber capable of supporting America's island-by-island battle campaign.
I was a riveter to start with, and then I was a rivet inspector. And we were working on B-29s. We had to do things down there that just kind of by ear, you know. To start with, we didn't know what it was, but then later on we found out when we got it finished. They set it outside the hangar. Of course, all the planes in had tied them down, opened them wide open, you know. And we came to work that morning, it was still dark. But anyway, you could feel the ground is shaking. That old B-29 sitting out there running wide open. Well, we could tell by the size of the parts we were working on that it was a big plane. When you're a 17-year-old kid, you don't think about a whole lot of things, you know. But anyway, I'm glad I got to work on it.
They were put into production before they was really fully tested. It had a lot of errors, a lot of bugs in it, if you will, and things were modified while they were being produced. You know, we really don't do that today. We get something that's pretty much complete and operational, meeting certain criteria before we start producing, you know, thousands of them or hundreds of them in these days. But in those days, they needed them right away. So they would modify an airplane on the fly, or they'd have kits to modify them in the field afterwards. And so initially they had problems. And in fact, at the very early part of their use, they had more operational losses than combat losses. And it was tough on the crews because they were working with something that was they felt was unsafe.
Such was the need for this aircraft, this super bomber, that they were nonetheless pushed through the manufacturing process with top priority from the US government. B-29s flew from the production lines directly to modification depots for extensive rebuilds to incorporate these latest changes. These facilities often lacked hangars capable of housing the giant B-29, requiring outdoor work in freezing cold weather in a struggle to make the necessary modifications. That's where one man who would become famed for his preservation of the B-29 started his relationship with the aircraft.
Vic Agather was an Army major who was heavily involved in the development of the B-29. He didn't design it, but what he did, he was kind of the liaison between the Army Air Corps and the Boeing company on the design of the airplane. So he was in the procurement business and trying to get all the B-29s going and off to combat. And you know, the airplanes were changing so quickly in the development and the way they were being built. There were so many modifications put into the airplane that there was nowhere to incorporate them in the production line. And so what they did was they took airplanes out of the production line, flew them to their first base in Kansas, which is where they were doing most of the training at. And in Kansas, they would bring all the parts to modify the airplanes to get them up to current standards. They started bringing all that stuff in there. And what happened was what was called the Battle of Kansas. There was a couple of hundred B-29s sitting out at different airfields in Kansas that all needed to be brought up to one certain condition and state in order to take them off to India and China to start bombing the Japanese. What happened was before the airplanes left all the factories, they knew which airplanes needed which modifications. There were lists, there were crates with all the parts and everything to do all this. All of that got loaded into railroad boxcars and shipped to Kansas, and the paperwork never made it. The boxes didn't have what was listed, and it didn't have a list of what was supposed to go in there and what wasn't. So one of Vic Agather's first things was to go to Kansas. He had to open up all these crates. He had to inspect all the B-29s and find out exactly which B-29s needed what part put on them to bring them back in.
Vic Agather and his team made their name sorting and assembling one of the biggest, most complex aviation jigsaws in history, with thousands of parts to work with and no real guide. This mission will be forever known as the B-29's Battle of Kansas. Agather ultimately prevailed, finally working out which aircraft needed which modification to become an effective fighting machine.
The airplane was an experimental airplane, had not been debugged like those smaller bombers, so they were not good airplanes. They were, I've forgotten how many, but several hundred B-29s lost over and around Japan to various things. And I guess not most of them, but many of them were from just mechanical problems and so on. My job was to keep the motors running, and I did.
The B-29 needed a more powerful engine, and Wrights came up with the R-3350, a duplex engine, closely cowled in the B-29 nacelle. But therein lay a problem. With the close cowling came overheating, and early B-29s, and in fact throughout its career, engine fires were not infrequent.
The engine was advanced and powerful, but flight engineers and pilots viewed it with rightful caution, and at first there was a far greater likelihood that your B-29 would be brought down by a mechanical failure of this complex engine than from enemy action.
They were not very reliable. You could maybe get 200 hours service out of each engine. Now, this engines we have, which is basically a -95 series, mated with a 26 WD rear case and blower assembly. Well, we're just about to achieve 1,000 hours on these engines, and then we're hoping to eventually achieve 2,000 hours total.
My interest in the B-29s is mostly in this particular airplane. And I don't know, I think it's maybe the fact that against all the odds, this airplane has continued to fly. Hopefully we can do it for another 30 or 40 years.
You know, the reason why we fly these airplanes is a tool to tell a story. And the B-29's got a lot of stories to tell.
The B-29 was deployed in the Korean conflict. It wasn't ideally suited for the role, struggling for accuracy in ground support operations. But as attacks on cities became part of the campaign, it excelled. With the memories of the firebombing of Japanese cities still fresh in the mind, the political hierarchy decreed that only conventional, high-explosive bombs be used. The threat of the atomic bomb capability of the Superfortress did, however, have an effect on peace negotiations. When the Chinese stalled for time, the spectre of an attack with the B-29 was sufficient to bring about an armistice. The B-29 was further refined into the B-50, which in turn was replaced by the disastrous consolidated B-36. However, the vision and concept of the B-29 lived on in the minds of the Boeing designers. When a new combat bomber was called for in the 1950s, they penned a six-engine design that was in essence a scaled-up B-29. That concept would finally emerge as the jet-powered B-52, named Stratofortress, in deference to its famous forebear. All World War II bombers have their fans, but the team who fly and work on Fifi know that they have a very special aircraft in their care.
You know, the B-17, everybody loves B-17s, and it's a gorgeous airplane. Anybody who says the B-17 is not beautiful is lying to you. They're beautiful airplanes. They're known as the Queen of the Sky. The CAF always called Fifi the Queen of the Fleet. And when I was a little kid, I'm like, well, that's kind of rude to the B-17, the Queen of the Sky, you know? She is the Queen of the Fleet and the Queen of the Skies as far as I'm concerned. Second only to my wife and daughter as far as just being the prettiest things I've ever seen, quite honestly.
29 Bravo, contact regional departure. Have a good day.
29 Bravo, good day, sir.
Climb 1.
Climb 1. All right, start a little bit of a left turn. Climb 2. If you see Cowboy Stadium out there, aim for the right-hand side of that.